Today I'm going to discuss about the history of logic, and the history of logic can be divided into four categories: Greek period and medieval period and modern period and contemporary time. In Greek time, there are four characters. Especially, we have to mention that Parmenides, Zeno, and Socrates, Aristotle, and Megarians. So, Parmenides was the first philosopher who used arguments because he never systematically formulated or studied about arguments. Sometimes he has been being used Pythagorean methods in early Greek period because there are some evidence that he was being his student or something like that. A second and more explicitly logical impact of Parmenides thought on Greek philosophies, though it's defense by Parmenides followers Zeno. Zeno's goal was to defend Parmenides' thought. So, especially Parmenides' view from the objection that they were absurd or in contradiction to our ordinary beliefs. Zeno has argued in many ways for this. So, this is one of his famous argument called Zeno's paradox of motion. I know this picture is a little bit complicated that you to understand. So, what is Zeno's paradox? What is Zeno's paradox of motion? I have explanation, little explanation here. In order to move from point A to point B, you must first reach the point halfway between them, between A to B. But before you can reach that point, you must reach the point halfway to it. So continue in this way. If you continue in this way, so we see that before you can reach any point between A to point B, you must already have reached an infinity of points. So which is impossible. So therefore the motion is impossible according to Zeno. I know Zeno's paradox of motion is a little bit complicated and it's can't understand at once. So when I read this explanation, if you wanted to know about this Zeno's paradox again and again, so I'll give another introduction from separate discussions, not in this discussion. So here we have to focus on mainly the history of reasoning, logical thought. Other authors to contributed to a growing Greek interest in inference or a Greek interest in logic and reasoning. So early rhetoricians and sophists. As example, we can say Georgias, Hippias, and Prodicus and Protagoras. So they always cultivated the art of defending or attacking the thesis by means of arguments. Right? The sophists were instrumental in bringing argumentation to the central position it came uniquely to hold in Greek thought. So, this concern for the technique of arguments on occasions merely led to verbal displays of debating skills. So, what Plato called heuristic. The sophists were, for example, among the first anywhere to demand that moral claims to be justified by reason. The next one is Socrates in Greek time. Why Socrates is very important. So when we think about the history of logic in Greek time, the Socrates is the very first person who turned those theories about nature into human life, and into ethics. So maybe he thought the moral improvement was the most important task in human life, because the almost all philosophers in pre-Socratic time focused on the universe and its origination and all. So he used dialectical method to argue, that means a method of inquiry. So he always seeks the conversation of with his partners. So he yes, according to those logical forms and historical analysis, and that it is very difficult to say that Socrates is the first person who create the dialectic method in philosophical history. But Zeno was the one who clearly identified the dialectic method. The meaning of this word, we can say, contested by scholars, but we may note three features of Zeno's argument in dialect. The first one is it is directed at someone else, right? The second one, it takes its start from premises and accepted by that other party. Three, its goal is the refutation of a view of that other party. So these three characteristics can serve as a rough definition of a dialectical argument. There are plenty of Plato's writings where he suggests that the practice of argument in the form of dialogue, it means the Platonic dialogue, dialectic, so has a larger significance beyond its occasional use to investigate a particular problem. The suggestion is that dialectic is a science in its own right, or perhaps a general method for arriving at a scientific conclusion in the other fields. So, scientific conclusions in other fields. These seminal but conclusive remarks indicate a new level of generality in Greek speculation about reasoning. Next, very important person is Aristotle in Greek time. So when we consider about the history of logic, so it is not an exaggerate. So that if I said Aristotle has a unique place in the history of logic, because the last person who was interested in Greek time, so Aristotle and many argument forms has been existed in that time. So there are many ambiguities has been distracted for a valid thinking. Therefore, Aristotle is the person who found the systematic logical form to resolve this matter. So therefore, we can say he is the father of deductive logic, right? He is the father of deductive logic, and it is very important regarding to this his writings, including a priori-analytics, the first treatise ever written on formal logic. So, and the posterior analytics, this being philosophy of science and theory of knowledge. So, Aristotle logic is so-called syllogism. So, it is always based on terms and propositions. Most of the times, Aristotle logic was concerned with certain kinds of propositions that can be analyzed as consisting of using quantifiers and a subject or a copular, perhaps a negation sometimes, yes, a predicate. Yeah, propositions analyzable in this way were later called categorical propositions and fall into one or another of the following forms. As example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, so therefore Socrates is mortal. Aristotle defined a syllogism as a discourse in which certain things being stated, something other than what is stated follows of necessity from their being so. So this is throughout the ancient world, the logic of Aristotle and his followers was one mainstream, but there was also a second tradition of logic. So that is Megarians. So at Megarians and the Stoics. So the Megarians were followers of Euclides of Megara, so a pupil of Socrates, and the Megarians were interested in logical puzzles. So many paradoxes have been attributed to them. So including a liar paradox, it means someone says that he is lying and is his statement is true or false. It means Mr. Pereira is a Sri Lankan, so he said all Sri Lankans are lying. So it means now we have a question, so his statement is true or false. The discovery of which has sometimes been credited to Euclides of Miletus. A pupils of Euclides is Megara. The Megarians also discussed how to define various model of notions and debated the interpretations of conditional propositions. So that is the last point that we can explain in Greek time. So in briefly, you have to mention exactly the Aristotle. So it means in Greek time, so Aristotle is the most important character because He is the one who organize and systematically give a systematical approach to the logic. So therefore, we can finalize Aristotle is, as we can recognize Aristotle as a father of deductive logic. And medieval time, so we can divide it into mainly two categories. It is the history of logic in medieval time in Middle East, and the history of logic in medieval time in Europe. The history of logic in medieval time in Middle East, this is a school of Islamic philosophy. Yes, Islamic philosophy. So developed by Avicenna. He developed his philosophy throughout the course of his life after being deeply moved and concerned by the metaphysics of Aristotle. Actually, he inherited a tradition of Aristotelianism, so which went back into the Islamic world. So Averroes and other Muslim logicians were based on Aristotelian logic, so and were important in communicating the ideas of the ancient world to the medieval West. So there are several philosophical schools in these traditions, and so those schools try to describe the structure of the reality with the rational system of thinking. In the 12th century, it became influential in Europe, particularly in Oxford and Paris, and affected some notable philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon and Duns Scots. So, in the other hand, this Islamic Avicennism is based on his later works, which is known as the Oriental philosophy. So, therefore, philosophy in the Eastern Islamic civilization became close to Gnosis and tried to provide a vision of a spiritual universe. So, this approach paved the road for the Iranian school of Illuminationism by Shawarwadi. Shawarwadi was a Persian philosopher and the founder of the Iranian school of Illuminationism. This is one of the most important philosophical school in Islamic philosophy. So this is based on almost divine and metaphysical source of knowledge. So he describes God as necessary being, whereas every other being in the universe merely possible. So the history of logic in medieval time in Europe, so this is very famous time and generally means the form of Aristotelian logic developed in throughout roughly the period yes in medieval, and the major so here the major efforts were made to show that Aristotle's ideas were compatible with Christian faith, right? So Aristotle's ideas were compatible with Christian faith. In fact, the thinkers or philosophers in medieval time always strive to use Aristotelian logic to prove their opinions about God is always true, otherwise to accept the existence of God. So it was the dominant system of logic in this classical time, right, in this classical world. So it is almost dark age of all the development of all the sciences. The theory of consequences. Consequences are hypothetical conditional propositions. Two propositions joined by the terms prepositions if and then. For example, if a man runs, then God exists. So this is the fully developed theory of consequences is given in Occam's Williams work in Summa Logica. So Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas and Saint Anselm, the famous and the major influences as religion thinkers in this time. Yes, after that, the modern time, after Renaissance, it has gradually decreases of especially a dormant or a inactive thinking process in medieval time. So I think yes, the development of logic with mathematics is the most important and remarkable events in the human intellectual history in this time. So mathematics is the most fundamental role in symbolic logic. So therefore, if I said so attainment or a distinction of this transformation has to be gone to mathematical philosophers. I think I think I'm correct. Yes, Leibniz can be recognized as a first person who identified this universal language. I mean symbolic system, and has a great influence between mathematics and logic. Thought he's the first person who used symbolic statement introduced into logic. So after that, modern logic, or the logic that is loosely called mathematical, so began in a serious and systematic way with Augustus de Morgan's formal logic and George Boole's mathematical analysis of logic, so both published in 1847. George Boole and was an English mathematician and a founder of the algebraic tradition in logic. So George Boole was the founder of modern mathematical logic and modern mathematical system in logic. He's a very good example for us, for you, for everyone, because he worked as a school teacher in England, right? 1849. After this, until his death, he worked as a professor of mathematics at Queen's University in Ireland. So he revolutionized logic by applying methods from the then emerging fields of symbolic algebra to logic. So where traditional, it means Aristotelian logic, relied on cataloging the valid syllogisms of various simple forms. So Boole's method provided general algorithms in an algebraic language which applied to an infinite variety of arguments of arbitrary complexity. So these results appeared in two major works: the Mathematical Analysis of Logic, 1847, and the Laws of Thought, 1854. The next person is Frege. So he is a German mathematician, and he's the greatest innovator in modern logic, to tell the truth. So he has investigated the logical relationship between numbers and argumentation. Yes, the next person is Frege. So Frege is the greatest innovator in modern logic. Then he has investigated the logical relationship between numbers and argumentation forms, and he found predicate calculus. In this predicate logic, he most important symbols, yes, he used the most important symbols are existential and universal quantifiers. So, which are logical counterparts of ordinary language words like something or someone. It means we can use existential quantifier, and everything or everyone, we can use universal quantifier. For this reason, the best known works in 20th century logic, the Principia Mathematica, by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, so employed a version of higher order logic. So this works was intended as discussed earlier with earlier to lay bare the logical foundation of mathematics and to show that the basic concepts and modes of reasoning used in mathematics are definable in logical terms, right? So after that, we have contemporary time. So in contemporary time, divisions of propositions, otherwise analyze the proposition, right? So analytical knowledge of statements is continuously studied in philosophy, and yes, it started from this after Renaissance. So it is started and then continue in this contemporary time. So especially Russell and Moore, so they used analytical knowledge of propositions to form of arguments in logic. So a knowledge is always based on experience. So and it is we call that sense data, and I see a red spot. So this is an atomic propositions, and so this is called a logical atomism in that time. So Wittgenstein is the person who explained about this and the about atomic propositions in his book, especially the very famous book. That the discussions of both Russells and Wittgensteins also had an impact the real impact on the Vienna Circle and Austria. And as the next person, A.J. Ayer, so he's a professor of philosophy in London, and he was influenced by Russell and Moore, and he has attractively written the language, truth and logic. So that is very famous book by Ayer. So it has been popularized more and more. Then his analytical approach to philosophy is known as a logical positivism. So it divided everything into capable of being true or false into two categories, in two recognized categories. So one was that of the necessarily true propositions, so typical of logic and mathematics. The other one is that of contingently true propositions of science and everyday discourses. Yes, the development of contemporary logic has been continuously happening because I think the utility of the language, the usage of language in practically, so and all. And about the Indian history, I'm not going to discuss in this video. So that is, there we have to discuss about the Chatuscotica, and it means the Buddhist and Jainist schemes we have to discuss in separately. So it means we have to discuss about that Buddhist scheme and four branch dilemma. It means some people call that fourfold scheme. It means Chatuscotica. The first one is A is B, otherwise if A is B, then second one is A cannot be both B and not B, and A is either B or not B, and 4, A is neither B or not B. So when I read this, you can just memorize the two valued and many valued logic. So I have to discuss in separate video about that. So because in Jaina scheme, you have a 7 schemes, and at the same time in Buddhist scheme, the first 3 schemes and the other fourth one and fifth, sixth, seven, and both together you can consider as another one. So then Buddhist 4 schemes, Jaina you have a 7 schemes, that's Sayadasti and Sayadnasti and Sayadasti and Nasti. So like that. So it means in English, maybe it is, maybe it is not. So maybe it is and it is not. Maybe it is and it is unpredictable, and maybe it is and it is unpredictable, and maybe it is and it is not and it is unpredictable. Last one, maybe it is and it is not and it is unpredictable, like that. So 7 schemes in Jaina schemes. So we have to separately discuss about the Indian history of logic and Indian history of reasoning next time, so I can prepare another discussion for you. I know this is the history of logic, and I know this is a little bit deep and much more details than you think. But remember, this is a very brief explanation when compared to other explanation. So about the history of logic, so this discussion I prepared for advanced level students in Sri Lanka, especially in English medium logic students, really anyone who really interests logic or philosophy. Finally, if you have any questions, you can comment below. Probably I'll reply. And if you want transcript, then you can send an email request, and then I'll send it to you. Yes, and thanks for watching.